Impeachment investigation. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi announces a vote into the probe about the president. Denied Holy Communion. A Catholic priest refuses to give the Blessed Sacrament to a leading Democratic presidential candidate. Reacting to the Synod. A priest from the Archdiocese of Washington tells us why he's praying for a miracle. And the divine plan. We speak with the director of a film about Pope John Paul II and President Ronald Reagan. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, October 29th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. The first current White House official testifies behind closed doors in the ongoing impeachment investigation into President Donald Trump. Alexander Vindman is an Army officer at the National Security Council and a Purple Heart recipient. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Vindman raised concerns about the Trump administration's push to have Ukraine investigate the president's political rival, Joe Biden. The president continues to say this impeachment probe is a witch hunt.
President Trump tweets how many more never-Trumpers will be allowed to testify about a perfectly appropriate phone call when all anyone has to do is read the transcript. Alexander Vindman, a 20-year Army military officer, listened in to the July phone call between President Trump and Ukraine's president. He says he was concerned by the call. I did not think it was proper to demand that a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen, and I was worried about the implications for the U.S. government's support of Ukraine. The call is at the center of the impeachment investigation. President Trump asked the Ukrainian president to investigate actions in Ukraine by Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Democrats allege the president was withholding military aid unless Ukraine followed through on the request. President Trump says he was just trying to uncover corruption, claiming it wasn't a quid pro quo. Now Democrats say the president is standing in the way.
It's the White House, which of course is trying to blockade witnesses.
Republican lawmakers defend the president.
The process is broken, it's tainted. They have gone through this process where you have seen one side of the story. It's been an effort to get one side of facts and then to selectively leak those facts in order to taint the president.
But Democrats are moving forward with the investigation and criticize what they say is White House stonewalling.
I can understand why the president doesn't want these witnesses to come forward. What I find harder to understand is why the Republican members of this body in this House don't want these witnesses to come forward.
On Thursday, the Democratic-controlled House will cast a formal vote to continue this inquiry. Democrats say they aren't bowing to Republican pressure for legitimacy with this vote. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Mitch McConnell says he'll be watching to see if the House's actions provide due process protections for President Trump. Wyatt.
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. One of the leading Democratic presidential candidates is denied Holy Communion. The Florence Morning News in South Carolina reports a priest at St. Anthony Catholic Church chose not to give the Blessed Sacrament to Joe Biden on Sunday because of the candidate's support for legal abortion. The former vice president is a lifelong Catholic. He was in South Carolina as part of his presidential campaign. For more on the story, including more from the Catholic priest, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. The Pentagon is increasing its efforts to protect Syria's oil fields from ISIS. Defense Secretary Mark Esper says the new mission also will provide funds for the Syrian Kurds. Washington is counting on them to continue guarding Islamic State prisoners. Esper also weighed in on the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. He calls it a devastating blow to the terror group. President Trump is hailing the efforts of one of the team members who helped find the world's top terrorist. He tweeted out a picture of a dog who was part of the Army Delta Force that executed the raid over the weekend. Officials say the dog's name is classified, but he is credited with chasing al-Baghdadi down a dead-end tunnel. Join me now via Skype to discuss the continued fight against ISIS is David Adesnik, Director of Research for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. David, welcome into the broadcast. Defense Secretary Mark Esper calls the death of al-Baghdadi a devastating blow to ISIS. Is he right to go that far and say it's devastating to them?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back on EWTN. So glad to be here. And I think it is a very important blow, but it's very careful not to exaggerate. It's very important not to exaggerate that when Osama bin Laden was tracked down by U.S. forces and killed in 2011, for several years, the previous administration exaggerated the impact it had on al-Qaeda and really underestimated the threat, which surged back in the later years of the Obama administration. Likewise, the Taliban has survived more than one leadership change following the death of its top figures. So absolutely, we should have pursued Baghdadi. It will be a blow, but we should be very careful not to exaggerate.
David, why is there such an emphasis on protecting the oil fields in Syria?
Well, I think there may be an exaggerated emphasis. I'm not sure the president understands there's only a few 100,000 barrels per day of production capacity there. In comparison, each year, Texas has been adding more than 1 million. The U.S. is the energy powerhouse. Syria is really a third-degree player in this field. But that oil is important because if Assad could control it, it could alleviate the financial strains he feels because of U.S. and European Union sanctions. There are very good, sound strategic reasons for keeping it out of Assad's hands. We also don't want it in the hands of the Islamic State. But we need to be sure that the best method of doing that is keeping the troops in static positions on the oil fields. I think there's a lot to recommend a more offensive approach that says they should be chasing down ISIS wherever ISIS is hiding, not just waiting for ISIS to attack.
Do you think this move to protect the oil fields will help U.S. relationship with the Kurdish fighters?
I think it is likely a benefit for them. They've really been the ones effectively controlling most of these fields for the past several years since we took them back from the Islamic State together. Although part of the problem is that they don't have a lot of markets for that oil since it isn't exactly illicit production. It's nominally owned by Bashar al-Assad and his regime. So some of their sales are to Assad in violation of U.S. sanctions. So we have a problem here, and we really need to find a better market for them or ways to refine that themselves so they can use it in the areas they control. It's a more complicated problem than putting troops on the oil fields.
While we're on the subject of Syria, what did you think of President Trump's recent moves regarding Turkey and removing the U.S. troops from northeast Syria?
Well, I think many people have commented on how callous it seemed toward allies who lost 11,000 men in the struggle and women in the struggle to defeat the Islamic State. Now, there's a strong element of realism and do what's best for us in foreign relations, but allies come in handy. Just as we saw the Kurds helped us track down Baghdadi, now we want them to play a role in the oil fields. The way we turned our back on them, leaving them to the mercy of their most powerful and vindictive enemy, the Turks, is something that could cost us seriously when we need an ally later on.
So you agree then with some of the experts who are saying they might have some dangerous repercussions in the long run?
Absolutely. Turkey is a very dangerous country in many respects, from supporting Hamas to allowing financiers for the Islamic State to operate, to allowing extremists to preach really some hateful Islamic-based propaganda. So the Kurds were a great ally in many respects, and Turkey has not been, despite being a member of NATO.
Okay, well, obviously we're keeping our eye on the region as well as what all this is going to mean, of course, for the Christians and other religious minorities in the regions as well. David Adesnik, Director of Research for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks so much for talking with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
At least 18 people are dead and hundreds of others wounded after mass gunmen opened fire at protesters in Iraq. It's one of the deadliest attacks since anti-government demonstrations erupted earlier this month. More than 200 people have been killed since the unrest began. The Prime Minister of Lebanon says he will resign. The move comes amid weeks of protests that have paralyzed the country. Demonstrators cheered the Prime Minister's announcement. They've been calling for the overthrow of the political class that has dominated Lebanon since the civil war ended in 1990. Pope Francis says he will make his decision about the Amazon region by the end of the year. He's reviewing the recommendations made this weekend by the majority of the 180 bishops who participated in a special synod. They called for the ordination of married men as priests in the Amazon region. The gathering that ended Sunday also suggested continued debate on ordaining women as deacons. Joining me now is Monsignor Charles Pope. He's a priest in the Archdiocese of Washington and is the pastor of Holy Comforter St. Cyprian Parish in D.C. He's also co-host of Morning Glory on EWTN Radio. Monsignor, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here.
In a piece for the National Catholic Register, you said your initial reaction to the Synod document, this final document, was to pray for a miracle. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there are a lot of issues that came up in the Synod that really alarm a lot of Catholics, faithful Catholics in this country that I talk to, and as well as myself. It's particularly the possibility of ordaining women deacons. That's very, very radical, and I don't even think possible. But and then of course married priests. It's technically a discipline, but it's a very important discipline in the priesthood. We have to completely rethink the priesthood if celibacy begins to erode and go away. Also, there were a lot of other things that went on at the Synod which caused great alarm. Certainly the concerns for pagan idol worship that was going on. There were other issues, during the Synod which weren't related, but where the Pope seemed to have questioned the divinity of Christ. And the reaction of the Vatican was kind of blasé, and a lot of Catholics were really beginning, it was like death by 1,000 cuts for a month. A lot of things. And so when I say pray for a miracle, what I mean is that I think there's great hope for us, though, because we should really lift up our Holy Father. Everything's on his desk now. And, I'm mindful of an event that took place in 1968 where everybody was presuming that Paul VI would approve contraception. And that would dramatically have changed the teaching of the Church on human sexuality and its purposes and marriage as well. And in a very surprise move, he didn't. The Holy Spirit came to him, and I think we should continue to pray for the Pope. I think Pope Paul VI would have generally been friendly with the people who had thought he should change the teaching, but he surprised everybody. And I'm convinced that somewhere, again, we lift up Pope Francis, that I'm afraid he would take the Church to the precipice if he approved those two things, particularly women's ordination and to the diaconate, and then also married priests. I think it would take the Church to cause great division. So let's really lift him up now and pray for a miracle like 1968 when Paul VI surprised everybody.
So do you think, noting what you said about American Catholics who are concerned about that, how do you think this is going to affect how they view Pope Francis? Obviously, we respect Pope Francis' office. We pray for him. Do you think this could have long-lasting impact on how people think about him?
I think there's been a lot of things that have been going on in the pontificate that have caused grave concern. It's the sadness of the name-calling and the harsh criticisms that he makes of Catholics who don't agree, and to simply dismiss these concerns. I think, there were a lot of things. So this is where I think I really pray, and I want to lift up the Holy Father and keep saying, I'm still your son, and you're my father, and I love you, and I want you to hear what our concerns.
Well, as you pray for this, Monsignor, do you have any just thoughts or any gut instincts about what Pope Francis might do with this final document, about what he might implement? Or do you think it's something he's just going to be thinking about for a while?
Yeah. Well, he seems to suggest he wants to write the exhortation before the end of the year, so it could come rather quickly. But I do think that ultimately, I'm convinced he'll do the right thing. It's not going to be an easy thing, even if he wanted to do it, to try to continue this discussion of ordaining women as deacons, and even married priests. It's going to cause, I think he's going to realize it's going to take time. That's what I'm praying for.
Well, we appreciate you coming on, Monsignor, to talk about all these important issues and to give a little bit of insight as well. Monsignor Charles Pope from the Archdiocese of Washington, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Coming up, Pope Francis makes an announcement about the Vatican's secret archives. And growing debt, one lawmaker's push to cut the federal deficit, and analysis. Pope Francis has changed the name of the Vatican's secret archive. The vast trove of documents and manuscripts now will be called the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The Holy Father says the word secret archive had too many negative connotations. He also notes the collections have been open to scholars for a long time. The hundreds of different collections in the archive date as far back as the 8th century. Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn wants to cut out waste, fraud, and abuse in federal spending. She introduced amendments yesterday for across-the-board budget cuts.
I think that this $22 trillion in debt is immoral. To pass that on to our children and grandchildren and say, we didn't deal with it, you deal with it, that's not right. So this is a way to achieve those cuts that need to be made to reset the baseline.
The Senate is on track this week to pass a 4-bill minibus package. It will provide funding for some government agencies, including the FDA. Joining me now is Dr. Robert Warren, a research associate at the Catholic University of America's Bush School of Business. He's a financial expert and a retired IRS criminal investigator. Robert, welcome back to the broadcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Before I get to Blackburn's proposal specifically, I want to ask you just in general, because you've called the problem with the national debt in and of itself an intergenerational theft. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is our elected leaders has run up a $22 trillion debt, and our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren are going to have to pay for it, but they had no say in the accumulation of that debt. It's like having your grandparent has a credit card and you get the bill 50 years later.
So presidents and lawmakers, as you know, have continued to push for years. I mean, they say it on the campaign trail, they want to cut spending, they want to reduce the deficit, but they often get much more pushback when they're actually in office or actually doing the job. What incentive do they have to go against the popular opinion, to go against the pushback they might get?
Well, it's something called public choice theory, which means that politicians do what's in their own best interests. They have to be able to explain to their constituents that the government needs to balance their budget or else their grandchildren are going to suffer. But unfortunately, they don't do that. And one of the things that has led to is a tremendous what we call the tax gap, which is the amount of taxes the government fails to collect every year, which is approximately $400 billion annually.
Wow, that's an incredible number. I want to go into your thoughts on Senator Blackburn's proposal. You're not convinced that the plan will work. Why
No.
not?
I agree that it's immoral. The $22 trillion debt is immoral. But she voted for the 2017 tax bill, which added $1 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. So it's kind of hard to say she's worried about the national debt when she voted for a bill that increased the national debt. Also, she has failed to address the tax gap because she won't adequately fund the IRS.
So what would you propose instead? What needs to be addressed in addition to that just hasn't been?
Well, she's right that there's fraud in the government and that should be rooted out. But she's not going to root that out by cutting the budget. You can do a couple things. Number one, I joke that you need to make the IRS great again. The IRS has fewer employees now than at the time of the moon landing. It has fewer IRS special agents now than I think since the 1950s or something like that. What they need to do is increase the IRS budget so that there's adequate resources to collect this $400 billion that go uncollected.
Like I said, it's not just Marsha Blackburn. So many people have proposals to do these kinds of things. They never always work out because there is so much politics on Capitol Hill. But if America doesn't lower the national debt right now during a relatively good economy, what are the consequences of this?
Right.
When will be?
Right now, we have what's called a structural deficit. Keynesian economics says that in bad times, what government should do is deficit spend to prop up the economy. But in good times, the government should pay off the debt it incurred when the economy was bad. Now we have a structural deficit. So even when the economy is going great, we're still spending too much money. Later on down the road, when we hit another recession, we're not going to have the flexibility to address it by, say, other fiscal measures.
If it keeps going, how do our grandchildren feel the effect of it?
Well, right now, the government pays $380 billion a year in interest on the debt alone.
Wow.
So that is just an incredible amount, and that crowds out spending that could be spent on education, healthcare, and other related things that help the poor and the marginalized. Mm-hmm. I don't know what our grandchildren are going to do unless we take care of it now. It'll come to a head when the government can no longer borrow money at a very low interest rate. When the debt markets decide that the United States is a bad bet, then they're going to stop loaning money to the U.S. government at low interest rates.
All right, well, we appreciate your financial expertise. Dr. Robert Warren from the Catholic University of America, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Up next, Pope Francis delivers a message about hope. And we hear about a film on St. John Paul II and the end of the Cold War. Pope Francis says Christian hope is like the air we breathe.
La vita del cristiano è in tensione verso.
At his daily Mass at the Vatican, the Holy Father tells us the faithful need to not be attached to anything. Instead, we should seek the security of the Holy Spirit, who's ready to bring us to an encounter with Christ. The Pope says those who place their trust in God will never be disappointed. A new film highlights the friendship and partnership between two important 20th century leaders, Pope John Paul II and President Ronald Reagan. It's called The Divine Plan.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
Pope John Paul II is a dagger aimed right at the throat of the Soviet Union.
The 80-minute film is a theatrical documentary that presents how, in some people's view, the two influential figures were part of a divine plan to end Soviet communism and bring about a nuclear disarmament agreement. The film will have a limited release. It's set for November 6th in 800 theaters across the country. Robert Orlando, director of The Divine Plan, joins us now from Rome. Robert, welcome into the broadcast. We just marked St. John Paul II's 41st anniversary of being elected Pope. What inspired you to create this film, and why now?
I think it's always been a general curiosity, the subject matter for me. Obviously, my last film was about the Cold War and General Patton, the starting of it. But I think specifically it was reading Paul Kengor's former book, Pope and a President, where he tied together the rise and fall of the Soviet Union during the 20th century. And he was the first seed for me to remind me again of what had happened. And then I looked back into it, found Carl Bernstein's work also there of Watergate fame, and he had written Holy Alliance for Time magazine, and then later His Holiness with a scholar from the Vatican. So I think together that mystery of thinking, well, two people from very different spectrums are trying to tell the world the same story, and it hasn't been made into a film yet. Here I come.
And you call this type of film a theodrama. What do you mean by that, and why do you think that's important to have this type of film for society in general today?
I learned that term interviewing Bishop Barron for this film, and since have learned a lot more about it. But the idea of a theodrama, unlike an ego drama, which would be its opposite, is that it doesn't just focus the light on the main character, but it focuses the light of the main character and his faith in God and the role God might be playing or not in his faith and his journey. So I think seeing it together was a way to combine my film expertise, a storytelling expertise, but also theology, history, even philosophy, as to what these men believed and how they carried out their mission.
And obviously we don't necessarily hear about theodramas in mainstream society today. Why do you think that's important to have this as it's going to come out in some theaters?
I think we have a skewed view of what acting and the role that theater or actor plays. We have a bit of a puritanical streak that finds its way still through the culture, and it's a longer conversation that goes through our history. But I think a theodrama reestablishes the wholeness of seeing the performer, the theater, the drama as the core storytelling that connects even our religion and politics on a much deeper level.
So when it comes to The Divine Plan specifically, what do you hope viewers will take away from this film?
Yeah, I say this all the time. I don't think my role as a filmmaker is to tell an audience what to think or what to conclude, but to take them on a journey. And I think in this case, the journey was the mystery of divine providence and free will, and where do they meet and where do they not meet, and how do we understand our own lives in terms of that meaning. So I wanted to take the audience on a journey. I think also, given the modern Hollywood indifference about faith issues or having to always cross over to an outside audience to tell stories where faith is involved, I thought this was an opportunity to go mainstream but keep faith in the dialogue with the audience. And I think it did, and it's almost impossible not to do that on some level. But I think sometimes Hollywood goes out of its way to dismiss faith. And all I was doing as a mainstream film director was reintroducing faith back in through the lives of this character and the impact faith had on history and even recent history, because this is only 30 years old. This is not ancient history.
Right. Such an important subject matter, too. And obviously, like you say, the role of faith is such an important role for both of the men who are the subject matter. Robert Orlando, director of The Divine Plan, thank you so much for coming on our broadcast and talking to us about your film.
Thank you, and I'll see you at the movies.
And of course, you may remember Pope Francis canonized St. John Paul II in 2014. And with that, we wrap up our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.